English translation. 715th Contact Part 1. Saturday the 23rd of February 2019. 21:51 hours.
Welcome, Ptaah. Sit down, my friend, and I hope we do not have too much to talk about today, which I then have to struggle to recall and write down again. My right arm, specifically I mean my hand and fingers, just do not work like they did before the accident last year. Unfortunately, the fingers have difficulty moving, repeatedly go numb and fall asleep, which means I often mistype on the keyboard and have to correct it frequently. With constant practice of typing, things have improved quite a bit, but I think it will take a long time for everything to get back to normal.
Greetings also to you, Edouard, dear friend, and thanks for your welcome. It is not surprising that you have great problems with your writing, because your accidental injury was not of a harmless nature and would have required a surgical intervention and a prosthesis or a new joint for the shoulder, as I diagnosed myself. And what I discovered over a period of weeks during several further diagnoses, I would like to explain a few things about. At that time, I examined your severe injury and also told you that the surgical insertion of a new shoulder joint was of necessity, which you, however, refused after the medical safety prognosis, and you did well. You must make sure that the shoulder joint guarantees pain-free mobility because it is the most mobile joint in your body and you must maintain its function under all circumstances. If you do not do this, you will lose a lot of quality of life and independence. In the case of the severe damage to your shoulder joint caused by an accident, a shoulder prosthesis would have been the only correct measure. But as I said, you refused this for reasons of common sense, because you would not have survived such an operation due to your heart problems. As I investigated, the shoulder specialist at the clinic in Winterthur considered a therapy by joint replacement and took into account the serious and dangerous risks to be expected. But these were not communicated to you, for whatever reason. It was only the surgeon's assistant who explained everything to you in response to your questions. As a result of which you then decided not to have the operation, but to take the initiative to try to heal your shattered shoulder joint yourself. With regard to the shoulder operation that was planned for you, the primary goal would have been to reduce the pain in your shoulder. But you brought this factor under control yourself, as you have always done in any case. Also, despite the pain, you have regained maximum mobility of the shoulder through unrelenting self-therapy, which is also not only unusual from my point of view and actually difficult to understand from a medical point of view. This is also the case with regard to your self-healing of the damage and suffering, which was apparently not detected by the medical profession, but which I was able to diagnose very well. In fact, not only was the main shoulder joint shattered and caused you severe pain and extremely limited mobility, but the acromioclavicular joint and clavicle were also damaged, and there was also bursitis or inflammation of the bursa, as well as very severe damage to the protective layer of the main joint. It is important for you to bear in mind that despite all your independent intensive therapy efforts, the muscles and tendons of the shoulder, arm and fingers have degenerated, and it is therefore difficult for you to achieve a very good result with good movement coordination in relation to your overall self-healing procedure. However, I have no doubt that you will also overcome the difficulties with your hand and fingers and regain their full mobility of use, even if your efforts continue for a year or a few months more. What you have achieved so far and at all without an operation and without a prosthesis or a new joint for the shoulder, of which you would actually have been in dire need, corresponds to a medical miraculum, at least for doctors who do not know you and your many abilities. I have found that all your self-healing efforts have not caused you any irreparable damage to the shoulder joint. For you have carried out your self-healing therapy exercises in an absolutely perfect manner. The whole shoulder joint has stabilized sufficiently again, and also the ossifying surfaces in the shoulder joint caused by the fragmentation and by the self-healing will wear off again in the course of time and will no longer create any problems for you, such as the cracking, as you told me last week. What I have to say now is that you have to be careful not to fall, because this could cause the humeral head to pop out of the socket of the shoulder blade in a hard impact. Although a specialist with good knowledge can reset the joint, damage to the capsule and other structures could be left behind. Even small loads can dislocate the joint again, so you must prevent the shoulder joint you have repaired by your self-healing power from being damaged again, and also prevent the ossifying surfaces in the shoulder joint from being abraded too much, as well as slowing down the wear of the ball and socket.
Thanks for your comments, but I think we need to talk about this some more, which does not have to be now because I have some other things coming up. I would also like to ask you what has come up in relation to my various questions. Firstly, about 3 months ago I asked you to find out what had happened to the woman who wrote me a letter about 12 years ago and asked me for advice because her husband had spoken in a dream about a love affair with another woman, and also in a dream that he was going to kill her. His wife? I have not heard from the woman since then, but I would like to know how she is today. She wrote to me at the time. I want to say this so that it will be understood later what I am talking about. That she had received my address from a friend who explained to her that I could give good advice to human beings in many ways. Anne-Marie was her name, but I simply cannot remember her surname. Written in French, I could not read her letter, as you know, because that language was never correct for me, except for pronunciation, which is why you then translated the letter for me, as you did my reply, so that I could also give the woman my advice.
The woman gave you, as her family name, but it was different because of her marriage, namely, Florina and Anjana did the research you asked for and found this out. Presumably, as is to be assumed, the woman did not dare to give her real family name, as well as her home address, which is why she had given it at the time as post restant, so post lagerund, as I remember. However, as far as the result of Florina and Anjana's investigation is concerned, this is unpleasant, because the woman was indeed murdered by her husband, as he had said in a dream, which is why she had written to you and asked for your advice. Unfortunately, she did not follow it and was murdered, for which Anjana and Florina investigated the husband's actions and discovered that he murdered his wife with a poison extracted from the bark of lianas, which is used in the Amazon by Indians as an arrow poison for hunting game. He stole the poison from the clinic where he worked, and when he was suspected of being the murderer by his wife and brought to trial, he could not be proven guilty of the murder. And this happened, as Anjana and Florina were able to establish, because nothing could be proven against him as a result of police, prosecutorial, and judicial sloppiness. The already elderly father of the murdered woman could not cope with this and fell prey to vengefulness, which led to him becoming a murderer himself and shooting his daughter's murderer, for which he was also convicted and imprisoned.
Regrettable, because why cannot human beings listen when they are advised to do something? So exactly the same thing happened as with Daniela Nagler, because I had told her 3 weeks before, when she was in my office lamenting her suffering, in a long conversation what was happening to her, and that she would just be murdered if she did not do what I advised her to do. In the process, I made an effort to look at the whole thing in terms of their relationship, and saw that in about 3 weeks after our conversation, it was on the 17th of September 2000, her life would end. But although I really tried to find out the day of her death, which I did before once in 1988 with Franz Josef Strauss and then with Daniela Nagler, but which I will never do again, and warned her about it, she did not listen to me. I roundly told her to lock herself in her room, especially on the 8th of October 2000, and above all, not to meet her boyfriend. But she threw this advice to the wind. As her brother told me later when he came to see me a few weeks later, despite my admonition, she was out with her boyfriend on a car trip, where he then murdered her. Look here, he still brought me this grief card with a photo of Daniela, and it says that she was born on 1958, so she only lived to be 42.
It is very strange among Earth humans, for very many are addicted to the delusions of religions and sects, esotericism, astrology and horoscopy, as well as occultism, and believingly accept their nonsense as truth, while endeavoring to get involved in their absurdities and to follow them, whereby they delusionally conjure up personal misfortune in a way that is untruthful and unworldly. But if really strictly considered honest, good advice is given to them, which in no way incriminates them in a delusion of religions. Sects, esotericism, astrology, horoscopy, and occultism, but which is solely truthful. Then they are completely disregarded, from which the consequences are then very disastrous.
That is unfortunately the case. Then my next question, at the moment the Anti-Abuse Summit is taking place in the Vatican, which will probably end tomorrow. This conference is supposed to be about creating future measures against sexual assaults on minors and religious women committed by male Catholic clergy. The whole of the mendacious Anti-Abuse Summit is supposed to be focused on the basic order of the Church's duty, with, fundamentally, certain lessons to be learned by all concerned as well. In what I personally judge to be a sleazy theater of Catholic clergy and dignitaries wearing regalia, the whole clerical power, precisely the religious and thus the presidents of the bishops' conferences and the religious superiors, etc. Also female beings, such as religious superiors, from all over the world should be involved. The conference Anti-Abuse Summit is, in my opinion, nothing more than a farce, which is supposed to serve to reassure those people who denounce all the sexual machinations and abuses of the many fallible Catholic clergy, whereby they can also present videos for their denunciations and for the planned training program, as well as witnesses who want to testify as affected persons what was done to them. There will also be a witness who will testify how she was raped by a priest and then forced to have several abortions by him when she became pregnant. And if one considers that the hypocrite in the Vatican in Rome, Pope Francis, calls an abortion a murder for hire, then it would have to be understood that he employs an army of murderers for hire, because the said rapist priest is only one among many others in the same framework. And in this respect, I can tell you a thing or two about what I have been told in many places in various countries by women who have been sexually abused and raped by so-called high clergy, priests and preachers, etc. of various denominations. This started with dignitaries of Christianity, through Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, as well as various sects and their chiefs. One woman even complained to me that her 16-year-old daughter threw herself in front of a train because of it and died, while a woman hanged herself after being raped, as her mother complained to me. An older woman tearfully complained to me when I met her as a sales representative during a home visit that she wanted to become a nun when she was young, was given the name Sarah as a novice, but then on the one hand was raped several times by her novice master and finally also impregnated by him. This while on the other hand, she was also forced several times by two nuns to engage in lesbian sexual acts. Her pregnancy was forcibly terminated in the convent by an abortion, during which she suffered permanent damage to her health. In addition, she said she was treated like a prisoner, but sometimes had to work outside the convent in a garden, where she also managed to escape because she could no longer bear everything. But because she was ashamed of being treated like a whore and was afraid that she would then also be insulted as such by her family, she kept silent towards her strictly religious parents and her two brothers, and moreover, the novice master had forbidden her any contact with them or outside the convent at an early stage. Since her parents and brothers, due to their religiousness, did not want to understand that she had fled the convent, because it was they who wanted her to become a nun. She broke off all contact with them and built and led her own life far away from the parental home, and she had been doing this for 42 years when I met her. But now, dear friend, I would like to hear what you have to report and what you found out from the dignitaries in the Vatican at the Catholic Anti-Abuse Summit. Also, you said that you would endeavor to find out how this summit of Catholic clergy is going on the one hand, but that on the other hand, You would also like to find out to what extent all these Catholic clerical powers are honest about themselves, and would out themselves, should any among them have been guilty themselves, if they have dirt on them.
To this, I can only say that I agree with your words, sleazy theater of Catholic clergy and regalia-wearing dignitaries, for what we have elicited from the bulk of dignitaries attending the Anti-Abuse Summit is most appalling. And what has emerged so far in the theater, as you call it, the whole thing amounts to a hypocrisy that has no serious background in terms of an interest and a will to change and remedy the sexual abuse of juveniles. Faith-based wards, nuns, and other Catholic-believing sisters by Catholic dignitaries and regalia bearers and ordinary clergy, as you are wont to call them all. If everything is looked at and investigated carefully, then all the conference is an absolute ridiculousness and, moreover, a fraud, because behind the whole presentation there is no seriousness whatsoever. Our astonishment at the fact that for the first time in the history of Catholic religion, a conference is being held in relation to an anti-abuse summit has led us to examine every single dignitary person of this anti-abuse summit, not only at present, but to find out about each person's entire life back to their youth, which has resulted in an extremely elaborate undertaking that has required more than 400 of our specialist staff, who are busy from the first day and until the end of the conference tomorrow. But we also felt the need to clarify what corresponds to the effective reality and truth with regard to the sexual abuse of minors by clergy of every dignitary form. So from the lowest to the highest Catholic ministers. We have established that not only boys, but also girls, as well as women of the Catholic faith, nuns and other sisters, have been and are still being sexually abused by male clergy of all levels. Homosexual acts among clergy and outside their direct sphere of influence are also common, as well as lesbian relationships between Jesus' brides, as you have already called them, or elsewhere. I also found out that nuns acted and act in the same way with regard to sexual abuse of underage girls and boys, but also with regard to lesbian sexual acts among their peers or outside their sphere of influence. I also want to talk about what you said we clarified years ago in the nunnery, but never talked about openly in our conversations. But now I want to do this, because in connection with the fraudulent and hypocritical anti-abuse summit, I am of the opinion that the time is ripe to openly state some facts. So I want to address what you say we have investigated. That you observed through binoculars at a certain location at the several centuries-old nunnery and something being buried, with you suggesting that it might have been a burial of a newborn baby. So we followed up your observation and explored the nearer and wider surroundings of the many hundreds of years old nunnery and found 3 specific locations that indicated that burials had taken place at these. So we investigated extensively. What we found confirmed your suspicions, because we found 182 small skeletons of newborns that had been buried there over several centuries. Through research in the past, we were able to prove that throughout the centuries, sisters of the monastery had been impregnated by clergymen and their fruit aborted. According to the 182 skeletons we found, however, pregnancies were also carried out and the children born. But according to our findings, they were then killed and sometimes even buried alive. However, as far as our erudition efforts are concerned, which we have been carrying out since the beginning of the Anti-Abuse Summit, in order to check the participants in the Anti-Abuse Summit, these have brought about extremely regrettable and unpleasant findings. Specifically, we have examined all the persons participating in this conference individually with regard to celibacy and its observance and their attitude towards it, as well as their actions, behavior, mentality, and responsibility behavior, and have researched them all the way back to their novitiate. And this was only possible through the aforementioned large-scale deployment of more than 400 experts in order To thoroughly fathom the truth of what is effectively hidden and hypocritical in the Catholic clerical power with regard to sexual assaults and abuses, and thus also disregard for celibacy. And with regard to celibacy, which you have often called illogical nonsense, as you also said in this way to Emmanuel on your return, journey with Ascot into the past, and told him how the fanatical Christian religion as Catholicism, and from it, celibacy would develop from his work. I also find the term nonsense to be just as uniquely correct for it. According to the information given by Ascot, who recorded your conversation with Emmanuel, he replied to you, after you had explained celibacy to him, that such a request was not only contrary to nature, absolutely nonsensical, despicable, but also such that sexual excesses and misdeeds would inevitably arise from it. In this regard, we have examined all clerical persons of the conference, especially with regard to sexual assaults on juveniles as well as other incidents, such as sexual assaults on nuns and faith-based wards, etc. In the past, up to the beginnings of their novitiate time or up to the beginnings of their formation, as well as after they have entered a religious community and continue to work in it up to the present time. The results of our research are, as I have already mentioned, shocking, for our experts revealed some catastrophic events and came to the conclusion that 73% of all clerics participating in the conference did not observe the rules and regulations of abstinence imposed on them from the very beginning of their novitiate. On the one hand, they engaged in homosexual acts with like-minded people early on, as well as during the following decades. On the other hand, they also carried out pedophilic or child-loving sexual abuse of juveniles of both sexes. However, in the case of the 73% of clerics who were found guilty, the investigations revealed that the majority of them were not only guilty of sexual rape of nuns or sisters of the faith, as well as sexual abuse of women from the circles of the faithful, as well as pedophilia and thus the defilement of children and juveniles during their novitiate and promotion period and further training to their higher offices, but also afterwards.
As I said before, the whole of this anti-abuse summit is nothing more than a sleazy and slimy theater, which only serves the purpose of hypocritically winding up and dangling the whole world on a fool's rope with lies and deceit, with the Supreme Conference prince, named Francis, conducting the slime theater in a well-considered mendacious manner and being careful not to harm a hair on the head of all the fallible child, juveniles, nuns, and women rapists. And this, in my view, is so that the regalia fract can continue in the old-fashioned profession scot-free, but in ignorance of all the faithful and with the hidden warning to the sexual miscreants, do not get caught. And in this sense, many lowly clergy, right up to the high clergy, will continue to do everything in the old framework, because the imposition of Catholic abstinence idiocy is something that is not feasible. This is because even the fanatical or otherwise God-believing priests have an itch in their trousers, just as the women and brides of Jesus who believe in salvation have an itch in the same area, which naturally has to be counteracted and remedied in one way or another, be it through pedophilia, sexual acts with their own kind, copulation with the opposite sex, or through personal manual labor or masturbation. Onanism, masturbation, and thus one's own manual labor, which, however, is idiotically and moronically denounced as self-abuse by Catholicism. For my part, I find the whole thing, that these 73% of the habitual priests, these arch-gentile sex abuse monsters, appear at this anti-abuse summit in a stinking, cheeky, and conscienceless way and participate completely impudently and innocently, although they know exactly how much dirt they have on them, and have also smeared their habitual sacks with it. Really much more than just a bottomless impudence and consciencelessness, but effectively an absolute depravity. What I also think about this whole papal comedy of smears is that the whole theater is, on the one hand, a bottomless impertinence towards the faithful, because they are being misled and are supposed to continue to pay their mite for these mendacious delusion-guiding sneaks, so that these sex abuse Pharisees can continue to indulge in their abstinence-less degenerate lusts. and the fact that they are not even brought before the secular laws for their misdeeds in this regard as, on the contrary, every non-clerical person of the people has to put up with who makes himself liable to prosecution for sexual abuse, is probably more than just the hammer of shameful injustice. But since time immemorial, this is only due to his hypocrisy. The Pope, with his sneakiness, who is able to prevent this from happening to the worldly rulers and rulers who are addicted to the Catholic religion and the delusion of God, by sliming them with his faith, namely by fraudulently lying that the fallible would be punished by the Church. This punishment, if any at all, consists at the most in a transfer to another place of activity, that is to say to another village, another town, or another country, and that's that. But if I now mention the religions in general in relation to the faith of the believers, then I have come to the frightening realization that in terms of religious fanaticism, Islam is at the forefront. And this results from the fact that human beings are driven and seduced into delusional belief by the hammering into them of the fanatical spiritual religious populist supreme religious leaders, as well as the equally fanatical religious teachers, who tell them in a populist way about their personal religious sectarian delusion. And these then themselves become susceptible to religious faith fanaticism, as well as fanatical and conscienceless with regard to hatred, revenge, retaliation and killing, torturing, tormenting, murdering, raping, massacring, destroying, and waging war, if they are driven and trimmed to this by fanatical faith delusion elements in a religious, fanatical, populist way. Basically, it is exactly the same as in politics, where the people are beaten up with populist phrases until they fall for all the nonsense of the beguiling whispers and believe all the nonsense, because they are clueless and incapable of thinking for themselves and forming their own opinions and decisions. I learned from your father Sfath in the 1940s what populism is, whereby this term actually originated from opportunism, which in reality corresponds to demagogic or popular incitement and inflammatory propaganda, which is carried out with the aim of conveying a certain line of thought based on lies and deceit. The fact is that every opportunist populism is absolutely, unavoidably, and in every case by hook or by crook, carried out through an untruthful, mendacious, and deceitful dramatization of the populist goal in order to win the favor of the people, or at least their great masses. And since the people as a rule consist of simple and not highly educated human beings, and are therefore effectively ignorant, respectively have no experience with regard to the populistically raised issues, do not see through certain connections and are, moreover, naive, they fall into a pro and hurrah roar with the opportunistic populists. And this happens as a result of the only low civic education of the people, who, as a rule, without distinction of age, are absolutely still green behind the ears, childish, naive, inexperienced, immature and innocent as well as simple, harmless, plain, uncomplicated and incomprehensible with regard to opportunism and populism, and therefore are not able to form their own personal and logical opinion according to the factors at hand, which must be said. Opportunism and the resulting populism are based solely on purely utilitarian considerations, which are aimed at eliciting from individual human beings and from the people an extensive willingness to believe in the false and fraudulent correctness, as well as an agreement and an adaptation to the respective populist goal that has been raised through lies and fraud. And what is fundamentally aimed at is, on the one hand, based on gaining power over the human beings and the people, whereby as a rule everything is aimed at bringing the human beings and the people under the opportunistic thumb with new laws, regulations, beliefs, and ordinances that are hostile to the people, freedom and peace. And in the second place, everything is also based on the fact that the elements coming to power can enrich themselves at the expense of the people through horrendous rewards or even unlawfully. Opportunism and populism are actually basically one and the same, although the whole thing is to be divided into 4 different forms, namely, 1. Politics 2, Religion, God, Faith 3, Literature 4, Ideologies. Sfath gave me 7 points that specifically characterize populism, and I also mentioned these points to a group of persons in Gießen in the 1960s, when I was traveling through Germany with a friend and was asked by journalists, politicians and psychologists who had a meeting in Gießen how I, as a globe-trotter, stood on politics and religious faith, and how I would see and judge everything. Consequently, I told the people, there were almost 30 of them, what I had to say according to Svath's instruction. However, nothing of this was published in any newspaper, only a photo and a small text about my girlfriend and me. However, several persons neatly wrote down the 7 points that Svath told me about populism, and thanked me for it when I told them that populism would become of enormous importance in the coming times all over the world, which actually originated from a self-designation of a farmer movement in Texas in the USA. Unfortunately, I cannot get the whole thing together today, also the 7 points.
I know them from my father's annals, so I can tell you. These, Edward, are the 7 points that my father named to you and that you named back in Giessen at the beginning of the 1960s. Without telling you who the persons actually were and what positions they held, however, these were in fact governmentally significant, as we were able to discover in our earlier research. And as for the farmers' movement in the USA, this was the Farmers' Alliance of the 1870s in Texas. 1. We are the people. The populists pose as representatives of the people and conduct their rhetoric with lies, deceit, and beguiling people's representative manner. 2. The power of language. The populists use popular, simple language that makes it seem as if they are speaking on behalf of the people, which deceptively suggests to the people that they are aligned with the populists. 3. Playing on fear. The populists stir up fear among their audience with all kinds of untruths and by conjuring up threatening prospects for the future. 4. Attention at any price. The populists use every opportunity to repeat their lies and deceptions over and over again in almost endless repetitions until they are so ingrained in the audiences that they become pathologically compulsive and therefore require approval of the populist. 5. False exaggerations of the truth. The populists state facts, but they exaggerate these in an exaggerated manner and create suggestive conspiracy theories from them, which have such a convincing effect on the audience that everything is accepted and represented as effective truth. 6. False news. The populists invent false, lying and fraudulent news on the one hand to effectively misrepresent existing facts, on the other hand to misleadingly present non-existing facts as existing through lies and fraud. 7. Effective staging. The populists take anything and everything in relation to themes. Things, events, factualities, planning, and facts, and embellish them in their favor with exaggerations in such a way that the audience is thereby blinded and misled.
Thanks. Then I can continue with what I was talking about. In terms of politics, opportunism and populism go specifically to political elections, as well as riots, demonstrations, civil wars, state wars, etc. This means that for purely utilitarian reasons, opportunism and the resulting populism effectively demand from the individual human beings and at least from the majority of the people an extensive willingness and adaptation to the respective propagated populist goals. The term populism, from the Latin populus, people, has been assigned several attributes by Svath, that is to say, characteristic qualities or traits which, from a lying and deceitful opportunist populist point of view, are supposed to testify to an infallibility. Characteristic are the populist intentions built on lies and deceit, which relate to politics, religion, God, faith, and literature, and which are aimed at both the individual human being and the nation. In terms of choice of topics and rhetoric, these intentions are geared to linking the mood of the individual human being and the mood of the people with the populist goal, and in doing so to nip in the bud and absolutely prevent one's own personal thinking, any formation of one's own opinion and personal decision. Populism is necessarily about verbally violently creating certain moods and belief factors in individual human beings, and in the bulk of the audience as well as the people, in order to achieve a believing delusion and dependence of political, religious, or literary form. And this, of course, only so that the populist rhetoric artists can make their individual human beings, a group of listeners or the majority of the people become believers in all the populist lies and deception. And through this populist believing of the individual human beings and the people, the unlimited exploitation and strengthening of existing moods for the populist propagated purposes can take place. In this way, populism manifests itself in various specific styles of politics, in religion, God belief, in ideologies, and in literature, the whole in every case and in every way as a strategy for acquiring power, acquiring wealth. Religion, God, and ideology belief, as well as literarily by false information towards the human beings and the whole or the majority of the people as well considered. Deliberate, malicious misleading and exploitation, or as a result of academic unproven hypotheses megalomaniacally declared as truth. Populist literature was defined by Fifteenth as any writing product that is based, on the one hand, on intentional or unintentional falsehoods, misinformation, and thus on lies and fraud. This includes information notes, books, radio news, TV programs, pamphlets, letters, journals, periodicals, newspapers, and all other written works. Overall, everything that is written down and published is considered literature. This therefore applies to all published writing, regardless of whether it is printed, handwritten, painted, or otherwise such when it is published. So published fake news or fake news also belong to literature, whereby these are manipulative and spread fake news and lie truths, which in today's digital age are mainly spread on the internet, especially in social networks and other social media, the so-called social media, or similar, and in part virally or like a virus. Politics, religion, God faith. Literature and ideologies as a whole are characterized by their operators in an extremely opportunistic populist way, whereby since time immemorial all religions, God's Son faith, God's faith as well as saints' faith, etc. have been dictated, which, moreover, are all dictatorial in nature, are the worst and most evil humanity-dumbing opportunist populist organizations that bring about hatred. Racial and religious hatred, discord, wars, lack of freedom, strife, injustice, and unrighteousness. So, as it is the case in politics, it is also the case with the clergy and all religious priests, who in all peoples instrumentalize the unstable human beings who are incapable of opinion and decision-making in a populist way, make them believers and drive them into the deepest fanaticism and delusion. The fact is that the religious sectarian delusion of God is also used for political instrumentalization and, in this respect, as a malignant basic evil of all religions, serves to dominate humanity and not to allow any free will of its own to arise in it. In this way, the entire masses of people who believe in religion become compliant tools who, as a result of their stupidity, can be incited to hatred against other sections of the population and peoples, and can be seduced into acts of war. And since the peoples of the religious delusionists are incapable of perceiving reality and its truth, let alone understanding it, it also remains hidden from them that every single religion or sect of faith not only corresponds to a dictatorship, but is directly linked to malicious terrorism. Fundamentally, the most malicious actors of all evil, of all uprisings and wars, of all hatred and all mischief on earth, are to be found among those human beings, peoples, and in relation to the entire earthly humanity, where spiritualities of all shades carry out their insidious, scheming, perfidious, tricky, devious, and reality, and truth-traitorous, populistic, and greasy hidden politicizing, as well as believer-bewitching greasy machinations. The religious faith instrumentalization thus corresponds to an insidious, hidden political machination that misleads the faithful, and this is, as I said, a basic evil appearance of all religions that make their insidious, dictatorial, terrorist, populist politicization the means of their might, their successes, their immeasurable wealth, and their interests. All clergy and politicians who invoke their religious faith in their offices are nothing but hypocrites and bigots or ignorant, misguided believers and faith addicts, who are incapable of their own healthy, rational thinking, and thus of their own opinions and decisions. The fact is, since time immemorial, that religions and those who believe in them have been populistically abused for delusional and political purposes, and this abuse is one of the cruelest chapters in the history of mankind, For from the whole of religious mendacity there have always been only brutal and terrible wars, massacres, bloodshed, hatred, strife, murder and manslaughter, betrayal, lies and deceit, as well as such horrendous overpopulation, that now the climate, nature, and its fauna and flora have already fallen into an evil precarious state of ongoing destruction and annihilation. Not only the sectarian mania of go and multiply plays an important role in this, but especially the manifold and immense hatred among the Earthlings themselves, because as a result of their uncontrolled mass reproduction they had to move closer and closer together and live together, which led more and more to friction, quarrels, acts of violence and wars, and also brings in the present time all the known destructive effects as well as many unknown to mankind. From the degenerated human mass reproduction, everything has led to discord among all peoples since time immemorial, which has spread completely over all Earth humans and led to acts of revenge and retribution as well as to hatred against other peoples and religious believers, and thus to religious wars and religious massacres. In particular, the religious sectarian faith factors, the delusion of God of all main religions, small religions and all other sects of faith have degenerated to such an extent that it is practically hopeless to be able to penetrate the minds and reason of believers in religions and sects, and to explain to them the effective reality and truth of the perfectly natural. The delusion of faith in God has clouded and even destroyed all senses of understanding and reason in more than the majority of Earth humans, in countless deluded believers even to the point of hopelessness, to such an extent that they have become incapable of grasping even the tiniest fraction of a jot of effective reality and its truth. In this delusion of religion and belief in God that dominates them, the great mass of Earthlings have become incapable of perceiving effective reality and truth, let alone being able to think about them and comprehend them. As delusional believers, they have become hopeless slaves of delusion and absolutely incapable of ever freeing themselves from their slavery to faith, as a result of which they are also no longer capable of cultivating their own rational thought processes and forming their own opinions. As a result, they, as delusional believers in God, fall more and more into stupefaction of reality, become more and more humble and dependent and tractable towards all and any false apostles, through whom they are exploited in every way and seduced into enmity, discord, hatred, murder and manslaughter, as well as war against those of other faiths, whereby the sectarian delusional leaders can enrich themselves tremendously and live out their lust for power over their believers. The entirety of religious sectarian faith and the deviation from the natural reality and its truth led the majority of Earth humans into all conceivable malicious and violent degenerations, to which no limits could be set and none can be set today. This also includes the monstrous and destructive machinations caused by overpopulation, which needs thousands of different necessities and things in order to be able to satisfy its abundant life. However, only a few environmental enthusiasts care about the fact that in order to obtain all these necessities, the planet itself, as well as nature, its fauna and flora, and all fresh waters, streams, rivers, lakes, and springs are poisoned and polluted tremendously by waste of all kinds, especially plastics, as well as the oceans. All warnings and admonitions are of no use, because the vast majority of the overpopulation does not care a jot, but continues unabated, unrestrained, and irresponsible with all the destructive activities. If the destructive and criminal machinations on planet Earth itself, caused by the needs of overpopulation, are taken into consideration, as well as the manipulations and cross-directions that have taken place on nature, its fauna and flora, and on the Earth's air envelope or atmosphere, then this naturally also includes the criminally changed climate, which is now causing enormous natural disasters. The ozone layer and the CFCs destroying this layer must also be mentioned, and I must explain a few things about this, because knowledge of this is very important, as Svath has already taught me. The ozone layer is to be understood as a part of the stratosphere, which is located above the troposphere, which surrounds the Earth at an altitude of about 10-12 kilometers. So the stratosphere itself is above that at about 15 to 50 kilometers above the Earth, and, as far as I know, contains about 90% of atmospheric ozone. Up there, in the stratosphere, The sun's high-energy ultraviolet radiation converts the oxygen O2 into ozone O3, whereby this ozone layer shields part of the sun's UV radiation and prevents too much of the aggressive UV radiation from reaching the Earth. While the ozone layer protects all life on Earth from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, ozone gas near the ground, however, endangers the health of human beings and the entire environment, irritating the eyes and mucous membranes and causing terrible damage to the respiratory tract. Basically, the ozone layer blocks a large part of the sun's aggressive rays and thus prevents too much ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth and causing damage. However, this is only the case when the ozone layer of the stratosphere is intact, because it then acts like a huge protective screen against the dangerous UV radiation. If we take a closer look at the greenhouse gases, they absorb the long-wave heat radiation and thus strongly change the energy balance as well as the average temperature of the planetary atmosphere, whereby methane, nitrous oxide, as well as water vapor, ozone, and carbon dioxide are to be mentioned as natural greenhouse gases. With regard to ozone pollution on the ground, I have learned that it is actually only problematic in summer, and also only when there is intense solar radiation that makes it possible to produce ozone from the so-called precursor substances, whereby these substances are usually produced from emissions caused by mankind. With regard to the destruction of the ozone layer, it is to be said that this takes place through gases, first and foremost chlorofluorocarbons CFCs, which used to be used on a large scale, primarily as coolants. CFCs consist of organic compounds in which hydrogen atoms are replaced by fluorine and chlorine atoms. I learned that the main greenhouse gases are few in number, but the most important is carbon dioxide, CO2, which is an odorless and colorless gas whose average duration of existence in the atmosphere is about 120 years. In addition, there is methane gas, which is mainly produced by cattle as odorless and colorless but highly flammable digestive waste gas, but which is also stored in the frozen ground and is now escaping from the soil and rock due to climate change as a result of the thawing of the permafrost and entering the atmosphere. However, this methane gas can be destroyed by chemical reactions, in contrast to the CFCs as greenhouse gases, which, as I recently read, are inert or inactive, uninvolved and inert, which means that they are substances that, as it is written, under the given conditions do not react or react only to a negligible extent with potential reaction partners, such as air, water, reactants, and products of a reaction. Finally, nitrous oxide is also to be mentioned, which is well known as colorless and sweet-smelling laughing gas. Among the many irresponsibly caused impairments of the atmosphere by mankind are above all toxic greenhouse gas emissions, above all CO2. But CFCs and chlorofluorocarbons should also be mentioned because, contrary to all false claims to the contrary, they still contribute to a considerable extent to the impairment of the ozone layer in the stratosphere, but no longer to the same extent as was the case in the 1970s and 1980s. When the ozone hole was the talk of the town, for which CFCs were responsible, but which hardly anyone talks about or even knows anything about today, in 2019. CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons correspond, as I recently read, to a chemical nomenclature according to IUPAC, whereby IUPAC nomenclature means that the purpose of this is to be able to clearly assign chemical compounds to their structure by their name, which is also referred to as the nomenclature of organic chemistry. According to chemical theory, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, or also freon, are an extensive chemical group of low molecular organic compounds that are known as propellants, but are also used as refrigerants or solvents. CFCs are or were, as I have informed myself, hydrocarbons in which hydrogen atoms are or were replaced by the halogens chlorine and fluorine, whereby these correspond to a subgroup of the halogenated hydrocarbons. CFCs, it is taught, contain only single bonds, which are called saturated CFCs. However, if there is no more hydrogen in the compound, then the whole thing is called chlorofluorocarbons. And as I said, in the course of the 1970s and 1980s, it became apparent that the release of CFCs into the atmosphere was damaging the ozone layer in the stratosphere to an extremely significant extent, and was creating the ozone hole. Subsequently, the use of CFCs was banned in many applications, but according to your Pleiaren, it is still secretly abused to some extent, and continues to penetrate up into the stratosphere, still degrades it to some extent, and also contributes to climate change. What is being done with this further and secret misuse of CFCs is effectively unforgivable, but no one cares, as a result of which the Earth's atmosphere continues to be very harmfully damaged by CFC greenhouse gases, just as ozone depletion is still continuing, albeit to a much lesser extent than in the 1970s and 1980s. In Wikipedia, I found the following about CFCs, which I will add to my words.
Wikipedia. HCFCs are partially halogenated chlorofluorocarbons. Their hydrogen atoms are only partially replaced by chlorine and fluorine atoms. They have a much lower ozone depletion potential than CFCs, and their global warming potential is also far below that of CFCs. In addition, HCFCs are already degraded in the troposphere and only partially reach the stratosphere. Properties: CFCs are very persistent, incombustible, odorless, transparent, colorless, and are often non-toxic or have low toxicity. The CFCs of the methane and ethane series have a low boiling point and can be easily liquefied by compression. Since they can absorb large amounts of heat during evaporation, they are primarily important as coolants. CFCs have a long residence time in the atmosphere because of their inertness. They therefore rise to the stratosphere and are decomposed there by UV rays. This releases chlorine and fluorine radicals, which react with the ozone in the ozone layer and damage it. In 1981, Verabhadran Ramanathan described that the very strong greenhouse effect of chlorofluorocarbons alone would warm the Earth's atmosphere by a whole degree by the year 2000 if emissions of this gas were not dramatically reduced.
The whole disaster of destruction on Earth began very early, because problems in this regard already started back then. When, according to today's calendar on the 31st of December 1700, the number of 529 million Earthlings was exceeded, which in principle would be permissible for the planet Earth by nature. Since then, everything has been done to increase the number of human beings through religious influences on the one hand, but on the other hand, religious wars have been waged, causing destruction. Masses of human blood have been spilled, and also nothing else has been left out that could cause harm to nature and its fauna and flora. Already at that time, plant and bird species, animals, creepers, lizards, amphibians, and creatures, etc. were decimated and even completely wiped out, which has also continued to this day. So everything started early and continuously and has continued until today, namely all the destruction of the planet, of nature and its fauna and flora, of the oceans, fresh waters, the atmosphere, and the climate, which has ultimately caused enormous natural disasters that will now become even worse in the future. However, if we look at the responsible behavior of the human beings on Earth, we can see that this is almost non-existent, because, as has been the case since time immemorial, it is only a few human beings who give the whole thing even a little thought. As a result, everything continues in the old style, because in particular everything is being done worldwide to destroy the Earth itself through overexploitation, but also through other criminal machinations. If we take a closer look at the idiotic drivel of scientists, politicians and other big talkers, as well as those in power with regard to the destruction of the climate and the environment, who pass absolutely stupid resolutions on climate protection, environmental protection, and climate improvement and put them into the world, then the whole thing howls to the heavens. The fact is that nothing but stupid speeches are made and even more stupid solutions against the destruction of the environment, nature, fauna and flora, water, sea and climate are thought up and decided upon, which are neither feasible nor useful, because the problems mentioned are already outdated when they are discussed, so that it is also not possible to implement them, because during the conferences that take place, humanity has already grown by thousands of new Earthlings. So the fundamental cause and the true evil of climate change and environmental destruction, etc., is not discussed, namely the massive overpopulation of the Earthlings and its endless further increase, and therefore no measures are taken against it. But only stupid, idiotic talk and completely senseless, insane concepts and procedures are thought up and decided upon. Of course, all this nonsense also affects the population, which muddles around in the same framework and calls and demonstrates nonsensically for a stop to climate destruction, but has not the faintest idea that the problem of climate destruction can only be tamed by a massive worldwide and perennial birth stop, as well as an equally worldwide and permanent birth regulation. But this climate change will then take centuries, just as it took centuries to bring about. But the alleged climate experts, who want to know everything better but have no clue what the origin of the whole thing is, and what effectively has to be done against it, a massive long-term birth stop and a worldwide birth control, do not talk about this. The climate hero troops, male as well as female, are on the one hand too stupid, and on the other hand absolutely incapable of even perceiving the facts of climate change and the destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and fresh waters, as well as the extinction of many kinds of living beings. Consequently, they also cannot find the origin of climate change. As a result of their self-importance and self-congratulation, because they bask in their titles, such as doctor, expert, professor, etc. In their ignorance of existing facts, they are also unable to make any logical or consistent judgment, so that they are and remain nothing more than stupid scroungers who let all peoples be bullied on a fool's rope. And the fact that they are also misleading and bamboozling all those who pick up on the whole issue of climate change and start protesting against it without knowing the effective facts and their true origin, that's the last straw. And this fact refers specifically to the young human beings who, on the one hand, are completely ignorant and disinformed about the truth of the root cause of climate change, but on the other hand, in their ignorance, incite each other to publicly demonstrate in the false belief that the coming climate catastrophe can be stopped if, for example, fewer people would pollute the world and its atmosphere with low-cost airplanes, etc., etc., but they do not realize or know that the real reason is the rampant overpopulation. And they also obviously do not want to know or understand this, because they do not want to see themselves involved in not being able to produce offspring. And this is exactly what the juveniles and young demonstrators with their "Stop Climate Change" do not want, because their personal egoism is not affected by the right to produce offspring. But the not producing offspring should only apply to others, but not to themselves. So when the issue comes up and the demand is put to them, they chicken out and in their ignorance even claim that overpopulation has nothing to do with climate change, because they can neither perceive nor comprehend its destructive machinations. This is an effective fact, which not only the majority of all juveniles and older Stop Climate Change demonstrators are neither able nor willing to think about, but also the majority of the entire Earthling population. And the reason for this is the same for all of them, because they think egoistically only for themselves, but not for the earth, nature, its fauna, and flora. So the fact is that practically all opponents of climate destruction are selfishly concerned only for themselves, because making and having children is a purely private matter in which no one should interfere. Therefore, it is impossible from the outset that even a hint of a thought can arise that no, or at least far fewer offspring should be conceived and brought into the world. And this is so because for all of them the very suggestion of such a desire to consider progeny for a long time or not at all is considered a vicious, privacy intrusive and unjustified intrusion into the absolutely personal sphere. And this egoistic attitude goes beyond all well-being and existence of the planet Earth, its climate, nature and its fauna and flora, because what does climate protection care if personal interests and desires are to be put in the background, or even given up by necessary measures to be taken by this? Well, there is now the 16-year-old Swedish girl Greta Thunberg, who skips school every Friday and demonstrates hysterically stupidly in public for climate protection. This, in turn, is a feast for all those scientists, politicians, religionists, and rulers, but also for large masses of juveniles, to make themselves important and big in public in connection with the introverted Greta Thunberg. So the girl is dragged to public events and does not know what is happening to her, and that she is being selfishly exploited by others, who thereby consciencelessly and carelessly hope to gain publicity for themselves, and can thus place themselves in the limelight of the world. And this is what they all do who rally around Greta Thunberg or otherwise consciencelessly use her as a figurehead in order to be able to shine in public with the image and word of their own personality, as well as with stupid speeches of lack of expertise. Greta Tintin Eleonora Ernman Thunberg, born on the 3rd of January 2003, has already become world famous as a Swedish climate protection activist, and her actions are also already being abused en masse worldwide by many juveniles as well as by environmental activists and also by high-ranking political figures. Greta's efforts, the child does not know what is happening to her, are attracting international attention, but on the whole this is absolutely hypocritical. The fact is that the truth is that the whole hype is not suitable or used for a consistent climate policy, but only to enable many juveniles, politicians, scientists, wannabes, and also government officials, as well as religionists and believers in God, to elevate themselves as big and important in public, and to make stupid and clever statements in pure selfishness and self-promotion. If the school strikes started by Greta for Fridays are seen in relation to the fact that climate change is to be curbed and stopped by this action, then realistically the whole thing is nothing more than a shot in the dark. Even if the Fridays for Future have formed into a global movement, which will probably only go out again as a flash in the pan. In my opinion, nothing will be achieved with school strikes, but rather unpleasant things will result from them, which may be accompanied by difficulties, even if Sweden complies with the Paris Agreement, for which I have taken this from Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, Politics. The Paris Agreement on Climate Protection. The Paris Agreement was adopted at the last UN Climate Change Conference. What are its goals and how are they to be implemented? An editorial contribution from Ekindersake, the 6th of September, 2018. The UN Climate Change Conference is a meeting of politicians and climate experts from around the world. It was last held between the 30th of November and the 12th of December 2015 in Le Bourget, a small town near Paris. This is why the agreement reached is called the Paris Agreement. It is the first climate protection agreement that puts virtually all countries in the world under an obligation. This is because all 195 UN member states have agreed to the agreement. Officially, the Paris Agreement will come into force in 2020. In the following, you will find out what the goals are and how the countries intend to implement them. What are the goals of the agreement? Limiting the temperature increase, the countries have set themselves the goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees. If possible, it should even remain below 1.5 degrees. Fewer greenhouse gases. The goal is to achieve a global balance between the emission and absorption of CO2 by the second half of this century. In other words, we human beings should not emit more greenhouse gases such as CO2 than can be absorbed by forests, for example. Support for poorer countries. The poorest countries of the earth are to be supported by the richer countries in climate protection, adaptation to climate change, and the elimination of consequential damage. How are the goals to be achieved? Mandatory reports, in order to track how much CO2 each country is emitting and what it is doing to achieve the common climate goals, all countries must submit regular reports. Financial aid. The industrialized countries have agreed to provide $100 billion every year from 2020 to 2025 for poorer countries. The money is to be used to help these countries to repair the damage caused by climate change and to use more climate-friendly technologies. Higher climate targets. From 2020, every country is to present its climate protection plans every 5 years. The new targets must always be better than previous targets. This means that the targets will be tightened every 5 years in order to jointly achieve the ambitious climate goals. The criticism of the Paris Agreement, of course, it is a success that countries were able to agree on common goals. But environmentalists think that such an agreement should have been concluded much earlier. They also criticize the fact that the climate targets continue to be set by the individual countries themselves and that they do not face any penalties if they fail to meet them. Incidentally, the climate protection plans submitted by the countries so far are not yet sufficient to achieve the jointly set goals. So there is still a lot of work to be done. Greta Thunberg is by no means a voluntary environmental activist, not even when she is presented as a representative of the international climate protection movement and was included in the list of the 25 most influential teenagers of 2018 by the American magazine Time. As I know from the internet, the 16-year-old from Sweden is celebrated in the mainstream media as a committed environmental activist who is quite selfless in her efforts to preserve the environment. Although the whole scenario must be put into perspective, because I think the child is being shamefully abused commercially, with probably at least the father playing a part in it, who is an actor and screenwriter. If you look on the internet, you can find the following, among other things.
At Die Freie Welt, the internet and blog newspaper for civil society. Papa Svante is an actor and scriptwriter. Greta Thunberg, the not quite voluntary environmental activist. Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old from Sweden, is celebrated in the mainstream media as a dedicated environmental activist who works quite selflessly to preserve the environment. But a look behind the scenes puts the whole scenario into perspective in one fell swoop. Facebook published 08.02. 2019, 59 hours by editorial M. Key, a young Swedish girl. 16-year-old Greta Thunberg has been flickering across the monitors of mainstream television channels and dominating the pages of the mainstream press for weeks as a committed environmental activist. The truant she stays away from class every Friday, supposedly to demonstrate for environmental protection, is hailed as a role model by climate change hysterics. Meanwhile, her unexcused absences from class are followed by students in other cities and countries. Greta, who is diagnosed with a mild case of Asperger's syndrome, is doing all this of her own accord, completely voluntarily and without any financial interest, they say. A look behind the scenes, however, quickly puts these statements into perspective. Papa Svante Thunberg is both an actor and a screenwriter. In Sweden, he is a regular on an early evening series and has thus achieved a certain level of fame. He is also the manager of his wife Malena Ernman, a well-known opera singer in Sweden. Papa Svante is also the managing director of both Ernman Production AB and Northern Grace AB, both listed companies in Sweden. Both companies have the same address in a posh area of the capital, Stockholm. The shares of both companies have risen immensely since Greta's first appearance. The key figures know only one direction, vertically upwards. Greta is supported by the Swedish initiative Fifteenth AB. This initiative likes to present itself as a purely idealistic foundation that does not pursue any financial interests. Interestingly, however, Fifteenth is a company listed on the Swedish Stock Exchange. It is almost superfluous to mention that these shares have also skyrocketed since the announcement of the commitment to Greta. And finally, Svante Thunberg and Malena Ernman have written a book about Greta and her commitment in the original Scener och Hjärtat, which is enjoying huge sales. How big would the sales of this book be if Greta stopped her activities? And under these circumstances, how voluntary is Greta's continued involvement?
It is also a fact that during all times of the past millennia and up to the present day, inconceivable cruelties, slaughters, murders, rapes, tortures, and massacres, etc., have been committed in the name of religions and delusions of God, not only against millions, but against far more than 1 billion human beings. All these atrocities, carried out in the name of their God and usually by human beings, have not led to the God-delusional earthlings becoming any wiser, but only more fanatically delusional and evil. Only very few human beings have turned away from their religions and their delusions of God, and rebelled against the delusions of God and the religions, while still running the risk and having to be glad that they were not murdered by the believers because of it. However, all the outrages and the insane and imbecilic contradictions of the religions and their God-believers still, today inevitably lead to terrorist massacres and murderous acts of terror being the order of the day due to the ignorance, unreasonableness, and sheer incapacity of the God believers and religion believers. The most malicious actors are the clergy, who are in office from the lowest to the highest position in fanatical religious and God belief mania, who act in a populist politicizing manner, gather believers around them through lies and deceit, make them compliant faith slaves and faith tools in order to then hatefully unleash them on people of other faiths through murder, manslaughter, and gun battles. In doing so, they pave the way of God-believing and religion-believing earthlings with horrors and countless deaths, whereby religions and sects reveal themselves as vicious, murderous institutions in relation to dictatorships and terrorist organizations. And this they do contrary to that they mendaciously and deceitfully preach love and charity and brotherhood and mercy. And that religions and their believers are only a welcome tool and means to an end for the clergy, for their insatiable greed for material wealth, in addition to the sexual abuse of children, juveniles and also adults, is something that the ignorant and stupid believers do not understand even when it happens before their eyes. Many clergy are so vile in this respect that they not only deceive unsuspecting wards, but also sexually abuse them because they are unaware of any need to defend themselves. Such clergymen are deceitful figures who are nothing more than conscienceless rags, who also have their dictatorship, terror, and tyranny paid for by their victims and make a living out of it. The fact is also that the whole thing is fraudulently denied by the clergy as a divine calling, and the believers, in their depravity of God and faith, take everything at face value. Unfortunately, the believers are so clueless that they can be deceived without any problem, and they neither perceive nor understand what it is all about. But the whole thing goes even further, because the delusional believers in God are so lulled by the lies and deceitfulness of the intellectuals that, as the shamefully deceived, they still put their might into the sacrificial coffers of the liars and deceivers, just as they also put everything they have at their feet in complete blindness and roaring humility and in absolute ignorance. And they do this on the one hand in the belief that it is pleasing to God, while on the other hand they do it to their misfortune, because they are deceived by the tremendous baseness that is done to them. If we look at the degeneration of the religions, and if I only mention these two religions, then a great deal can be found in Christianity, in particular in the time and in the implementation of the Inquisition. But we cannot stop at Islam either, because there is also much to be said about the Arab Umayyad dynasty, which is considered the first dynasty of the caliphs and which ruled from 661 to 749-750, but was then overthrown by the Abbasids, or members of a caliphic dynasty based in Baghdad. Their center of government was in Damascus, and between 756 and 1031 there was an Umayyad emirate in Cordoba, which had been a caliphate since 929. The Umayyads also Umayyads? Umayyads were a dynasty that were mostly warmongering tyrant rulers of the Islamic Empire, as a result of which murders, revolts, and wars were repeatedly instigated, which ultimately resulted in the so-called tragedy of Ashura, whereby a deviation from the Islamic ideal took place, and the Islamic world community did not recover in terms of content for more than a millennium. Wars, barbarism, Campaigns and murder over the caliphates were the order of the day, but in the end, the Umayyad dynasty finally came to an end. Well, the indisputable fact is that the so-called alleged divine will is the core and thus the absolute ultimate of every religion and delusion, which means that the human will is replaced by that of an imaginary god. The delusional devotion to a non-existent god and the delusional will with which this is believed in is effective and absolutely indispensable in delusional belief in God. Only in this way is it also possible for every clergyman to achieve success with the faith-prone earthlings through his faith-populist political smack talk. If this exchange, precisely that the human will is replaced by that of an imaginary god, cannot be accomplished, then the whole thing fails, because then the human being cannot be deceived by the mendacious populist efforts of the clergyman. And if that were the case, then it would be impossible from a religious point of view to recognize a mistake that has been made, which is why there would then be no sin, but consequently also no degeneration of religion, for the sole reason that if human beings have their own will and also use it themselves and act according to it, then they are themselves responsible for everything they think, do, act, and how they behave. Consequently, he is not indebted to anyone outside himself, to whom he would be obliged by having to obey his will, or his order, instruction or command, law or commandment, etc. So if the human being keeps and obeys his own will and does not humbly blindly hand it over to an imaginary god, then he can also not act against a will of God and thus also not commit a sin and not be punished by God. The clergy all know very well about the fact that the alleged will of God plays the most important role of all for the delusional believers. Consequently, all these religious populist politicizing clergy are fully aware that the believers in their delusion of faith rely on their God to think for them, to direct them, to do their bidding, and to rule for them. So the spiritualities know very well that the God-believing human beings take the lies and deceit seriously, and at face value, and live under the delusion and stupidly believe that the will of God is of decisive importance for their weal and woe, and that he is responsible for everything and determines their fate. Consequently, they also delusionally sink into senseless hopes and delusion according to alleged divine will, and not through their personal human will, and become the tool of religious and political interests, for which they stupidly and fatuously go to wars and battles for their religions and their faith and forfeit their lives. And finally, it is due to religions that prophets lose their human moral guiding function, and they are purposefully transformed into an otherworldly or heavenly existence to supposedly spread salvation and religious enthusiasm, deified to ultimately reach heaven.
I can fully sympathize with all your words in every respect. This also in regard to the clergy, who surpass themselves in lies and deceit, in hypocrisy, and, as you say, in depravity in regard to lies and deceit, and allow themselves all evil. And this surpasses everything that the human being has to deal with in his life, depending on whether he is more or less devout or not.
You are, I notice, very much affected, dear friend. It is probably better if we end this subject. Therefore, I would like to ask you something that is currently causing a lot of publicity, especially in Switzerland and Germany, but which has been talked about for some time. It is about the fact that for some time now, legal proceedings have been brought against women and men who joined the Islamist state in Syria and Iraq and are now to be judged after their return or repatriation. But what they did in the IS, whether they murdered human beings or not, or whether they only did administrative work for the IS terrorist organization, that of course cannot be proven against them. So the judicial consequence will be that the culprits will probably get off with conditional sentences because they cannot be proven by the courts back home to have murdered. Because killing in the IS is effectively nothing other than murder. In my opinion, active participation in the IS terrorist organization is in any case to be judged as murder of innocent human beings, even if only administrative work is done, because this also serves murder. In Switzerland, however, men can come to the cash register and be sentenced, namely because a Swiss citizen's participation in IS or in a foreign army is punishable as foreign military service, and a violation of Swiss neutrality. For my part, I think that if his murderers etc. are captured in a country where they are carrying out their criminal deeds, of whatever kind, they should also be tried, convicted, and sentenced there and thus not taken back home, as the pathologically stupid oaf Trump as US President demands of Germany to the contrary. What do you think about that, Ptaah?
If such a thing were to happen, as you have mentioned, then my opinion and my actions would be such as you have expressed your opinion. However, I must explain to the whole that in all our peoples on all 4 worlds we have had no crime and no violent crime for over 52,000 years. This is because all our peoples are peaceful and, also with regard to all their behavior, only orientate themselves towards living in peaceful coexistence with everything and everyone that exists. So with regard to all peoples and humanities, human-like, human-similar, and other higher life forms, in which, however, the whole of nature and its fauna and flora are also included. As you asked me, I also heard from your tone the question of what we Pleiaren in general would do in the situation you mentioned, if Pleiaren were to commit unlawful acts in foreign countries. To this I must say that even though we have had no crime and no violent crimes for 52,000 years, we nevertheless have a wide-ranging legislation to regulate all conceivable affairs. Occurrences, events, occurrences, objects, occurrences, possibilities, occurrences, things, parts, matters, subjects, and occurrences, etc., that come into existence. This also includes a legal regulation which refers to the fact that if such an improbability were to arise, a person commits an unlawful act or deed in a foreign place, this person would have to be brought to account there in the territory of the act or deed carried out. Thus, in that sector, the population there would have to be summoned to account for the punishability of the unlawful act or deed, and would have to issue an appropriate assessment of the measure to be taken, which, however, would in any case have to be in a humane but nonetheless in a sustainable punishable framework, in which the person in question, who had committed an offense, would have to fit in. Jurisdiction and punishment in the sense that they are commonplace among Earth humans have not existed here for more than 52,000 years. I therefore believe that we Pleiaren have all conceivable possible and necessary legislation, and also that which is necessary for all possible emergencies, by which all things and also penal provisions, etc., are regulated. However, because we know neither crime nor violent crime or any degenerations in the coexistence of our humanity, we do not have any jurisdictions. As a result of which the populations of a place would be called to account and demand accountability if, improbably, any unlawful actions, deeds, and incidents, etc. were to occur.
The Earthlings can forget about such a thing, because such a system of peace, equality, justice, and freedom as well as righteousness is absolutely impossible in the way they are formed by the damnable religions and sects and the resulting delusion of God. This is simply because every religious delusion does not allow every believer to perceive, recognize, and understand the degenerations, evil, and violence that are modernizing his inner character, and therefore also not to grasp them willingly and not to transform them for the better. However, we have often talked about this, but the majority of humanity is not willing to think about what it really has to do in relation to itself for a transformation to the good. Fundamentally, the majority of all Earthlings have no interest in this, but on the one hand only for their religious delusion, which brings harm, death, destruction, discord, unfreedom, ill will, and all kinds of other mischief to the whole world, and on the other hand in the way of thinking only for themselves in such a way that every fellow human being is no more than dirt, if they can be profited by it. The majority of Earthlings think only of their personal well-being, indulging in luxury, in the exuberant fulfillment of personal desires and living in self-indulgence, arrogance, wanting to be better than their fellow human beings, and everything that brings only personal benefit in every respect. And it does not matter whether this means having to go through hardship and misery, or even over the corpse of their fellow human beings, or even their own family members.
If I did not know you better,
It's good. You do not have to go on. Because on the one hand, I know what you are going to say, and on the other hand, I just have to keep saying what is fact.